Okay, ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to call the meeting to order. This is meeting number of the Standing Committee of Justice and Human Rights, meeting number 36. We're here as order of reference on Monday, June 16th, 2014. Bill C-36, an act to amend the criminal code in response to the Supreme Court of Canada decision in Attorney General of Canada versus Bedford, and to make consequential amendments to other acts. Before the meeting started, Madame Boivin, you approached me about speaking, so I'll turn the floor over, and then we'll get to the witness introductions.
Madame Boivin speaking in the same sentence, that's so rare. There seemed to be some confusions on the aspect of criminal record versus no criminal record, prendre les empreintes digitales.
Fingerprinting, etc. So I'm just wondering if we could get some information. Several of us on both sides have put the question to, and I'm wondering if perhaps our analysts could hear what they have to say about this. I don't necessarily want to speak to my experience on the subject, but perhaps our analysts could speak to us, so at least we could move on from this point.
Chair, I'm also concerned about this. I think we need to clarify the actual state of the law in this matter, and I think the appropriate people to do so are the Justice Department's officials who are experts in criminal law, and we have asked them to prepare a memo to the committee on this point. So I hope to have that soon, hopefully maybe today or at the latest tomorrow morning. I would then suggest that the committee members have an opportunity to review it, and if they wish to ask questions, we could ask those justice officials to come back before the committee to answer any questions.
That sounds all right to me. It's just that I heard that they had done already the work, our analysts, and since I view, unless you're telling me that their views are not sound usually.
I just think the justice officials are probably more.
I will not start a debate on that, but based on some of their advice, sometimes I wonder.
Okay, so here's what I will do, based on the information that's been provided. We'll wait till the memo is circulated to all members, and then based on that memo, if we want to invite the I keep calling them staff, the officials to come, and we'll set off 10, 15 minutes at the end of one of the meetings, and of course our analysts are here also to provide information at the same time.
Then can I just add, if you are ready on the issue, maybe if you want to send us, usually you write a little document, if you can send it to all the members of the committee at the same time, it'd be very interesting. If everybody is agreeing, the more the merrier. Okay. If there's still some conflict, then we'll decide what we do next. Thanks.
Okay. Very good. Everyone's good? Okay, let's go on to our witnesses today for our second panel of this on C-36. And we are actually waiting for two folks, but we will, I'm hoping they will arrive. But anyways, from the London Abused Women's Centre, we have Megan Walker, who's the Executive Director. From Rising Angels, we have Katerina McLeod. And then by video conference, and there are two people at the same location, and there are two individual presentations, though. From the Canadian Association of Elizabeth Fry Societies, we have Kim Pate. And then from Sisters Inside, we have Deborah Kilroy, who's the Executive Officer and Legal Counsel. So we'll have our witnesses that are here with us first, and then if our other witnesses join us, we'll introduce them appropriately. So our first witness with 10 minutes is from the London Abused Women's Centre. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I would first of all like to thank all of you for the kind invitation to attend today, and in particular like to acknowledge that you do have an incredible Justice Department, and particularly thank Ken Bendrak, Nancy Baker, and Francoise Delisle for their kind assistance in helping us through this process. MP Joyce Smith has been a great advocate for us, and we appreciate her, as well as her executive assistant Joel Osterman. I am going to be making reference to statistics, and those references can be found in our brief, which you will have. The London Abused Women's Centre provides advocacy, counselling, and support to abused women, and has been doing that for the last 36 years. During our last fiscal year, we served approximately 3,300 women and girls over the age of 12. Approximately 10% of the women and girls that we serve have disclosed that they were at one time in prostitution, and we do provide them with exit supports. And those supports are obviously directed by the women themselves. We have heard that sex workers have not been consulted, and I think that needs to be addressed because, in fact, we do know that prostituted women and survivors have been consulted. And, in fact, many of the women we have served were part of the survey that was online, and, in addition, participated in a postcard project that we initiated at the London Abused Women's Centre along with Eve and Sex Trade 101. And postcards were sent out across the country, and 10,000 of those have been sent back to MP Joyce Smith. And I do want to acknowledge the incredible courage of women in prostitution and survivors in speaking out in favor of Bill C-36. It does take a lot of courage to come and speak out. I've heard over the last couple of days here today and yesterday and also in the past that prostitution has always been around. And I'd like to address that because so too has domestic violence, rape, harassment, stalking, and even murder. But we don't just say, well, these things have always been here, and as a result, we're just going to throw up our hands and do nothing about them. In fact, we work to change those scenarios for vulnerable people. And one of the things that has always excited me has been the importance of public education and awareness campaigns and the effectiveness of those. And we don't need to look much further than the effectiveness of public awareness campaigns such as Mad Canada and how effective those have been in changing the attitudes of Canadians about impaired driving. And I think we can do that with prostitution as well. Through our work at the London Abused Women's Centre, we have seen a strong link between domestic violence and prostitution. And in fact, many of the prostituted women that come to see us report that their intimate partners are also their pimps. It is a coercive, controlling, and abusive relationship, and the tactics that are utilized by the woman's partners and pimp in that combined role adds to the complexities of their lives. And we need to recognize that relationship in order to understand the issues and the realities faced by these women. We've also heard a lot about how prostitution is work and should be considered legitimate employment. Catherine McKinnon, who is a feminist and a legal scholar, has often stated that in an unequal world, a law against men purchasing women is called for, together with no law against the people, mainly women, being bought for sexual use. Ending prostitution by ending the demand for it is what sex equality under the law would look like. And I think we need to remember that as we go through some of your deliberations. Prostitution is fundamentally men's violence against women. And although we do recognize that there are some men in prostitution, overwhelmingly it is men that are buying women and women that are being prostituted. Prostitution is a human rights violation. Legitimizing prostitution as work normalizes this as an employment option, and it ignores the link between prostitution and sex trafficking. It sanctions the inequality of women and girls, and it increases the demand by promoting social acceptance of sexual exploitation. The province of Ontario has held for many years a program called Take Your Child to Work Day, and it's for grade 9 students who are about age 14, who have the opportunity to go and explore employment options of their parents. And I can't imagine taking a 14-year-old girl to work with their mother that day in prostitution, nor can I imagine a father taking their child to work and having him say, "Hey son, it's lunchtime, we're off to buy sex from a woman." These are not options that should be made available to children or women. The London Abused Women's Centre does not recognize prostitution or sex trafficking as work. We refer to this as prostituted women or women in prostitution, and I would ask that today you respect that language when you are addressing questions to me or any of the panelists. We've also heard that prostitution is consensual sex between adults, and fundamentally the London Abused Women's Centre disagrees with this statement. There's an infamous quote by former Prime Minister Pierre Trudeau that's often used to support this message, which is, "There's no place for the state in the bedrooms of the nation." And that's from 1969. That quote is not relevant today in the prostitution discussion or in most discussions today. And in fact, Trudeau himself knew the state had a place in the bedrooms of the nation when he passed Bill C-127, making sexual assault against one's wife an offense. And he was, in fact, Prime Minister of the day when that happened in 1983, and it was his government that initiated and passed that bill. We've heard many times that women enter prostitution as children. The Canadian Women's Foundation reports through consultations with 260 Canadian organizations and 160 survivors of sex trafficking that many girls in Canada are first trafficked into forced prostitution when they are 13 years old. I think we can all agree that children are too young to consent. If we follow that, then a child of 17 or younger who then turns 18 cannot then all of a sudden be a consenting adult, given their background as children in prostitution. And we often hear about power imbalances between adults in positions of power, like coaches, for instance, or teachers who lure children into sexual relationships with them. And we're appalled as a society when these things happen. So how is it then that those same teachers or coaches can buy youngsters, young women, 20, 21 years of age, and because all of a sudden they're paying to have sex with these young women, it's consent? It's the exact same thing as those teachers and coaches luring those young women without paying them. We've heard a lot about the public communication for the purpose of prostitution, and how that's important for prostituted women to be able to have that sense of security. Well, in fact, that is a false sense of security. The prostituted women that we work with tell us that no amount of communication with a John will make their lives safer. And in fact, they often are given only 5 or 10 minutes, or even at the outset, 30 minutes to communicate with a John. And at that point, really, there's no opportunity to interview properly for safety. Prostitution, as we know from the government's preamble, is inherently violent and dangerous. And it is Johns and pimps that place the lives of women in danger. We believe that the C-36 is very powerful in its preamble. We believe if you look at the New Zealand model, which has been much touted, it promotes increased prostitution, increased number of children being promoted for prostitution. We know that it puts women into unfortunate situations of underground prostitution because they don't have to be regulated in their homes where there are fewer than 4 women. We know the Prostitution Collective in New Zealand has reported in Christchurch 2 women dead in over a 6-month period of time, murdered by Johns, increased violence, 147 women violated brutally. And when you compare that, which is the model that they are promoting, I would suggest to you that that is exactly the reason we don't want that model in Canada. There are 3 recommendations I would make to you with respect to Bill 36. One is that we would like to see women decriminalized in all situations. We know that Johns and pimps are criminalized under all circumstances and in fact face additional sanctions when purchasing women where they ought to know there are children. I think that is enough of a deterrent, and we want to end demand. And by ending demand, it will allow prostituted women to exit. And I think that criminalizing women is inconsistent with your preamble. And I also know from running exit programs that criminalizing women, detaining women, or arresting women is a barrier to exiting. I would also suggest to you that as much as I am so grateful for the funding of $20 million over 4 or 5 years, that you would give some consideration to increasing that funding, because as we place that funding across the country, it may not be enough or sufficient to provide women with the provisions they need to exit safely. And finally, I would like to address an issue around torture, and this is 30 seconds, Mr. Chairman, I appreciate it, which is that the Criminal Code, Section 269.1, currently defines torture as any act or omission by which severe pain or suffering, whether physical or mental, is intentionally inflicted on a person. But unfortunately, it is specific only to officials. And we would suggest to you that prostitution is torture in every sense of the word, and we would ask that you amend that clause by stating that every person, not just officials, would be held criminally responsible for torture. And I appreciate the extra time you've given me. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Ms. Walker. Our next presenters, I'm assuming they're ready, is the Native Women's Association of Canada, and we have Michelle Odette with us and Teresa Edwards. And I'm assuming, Ms. Odette, you're taking the lead.
Bon, ben merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much.
Détaillant. Alors, merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much to the Anishinaabe for allowing us on their territory. I'm going to speak in both languages today. So I'll start by saying good afternoon to everyone around the table. Once again, it's a pleasure to meet with all of you and to have an opportunity to discuss an issue very respectfully, because it's an issue that can divide people, and therefore we should debate it respectfully. So thank you for the invitation. And on a personal and professional note, both, I would say that this is an issue that affects us very deeply, as you'll see. Now, our association has existed since 1974, so 40 years of hope, 40 years of dealing with issues that affect all of us here in Canada. From the very beginning, we have fought to improve living conditions for women and their families, from the socio-economic perspective, as well as from a legal and public safety and human rights perspective. As you know, this issue affects Aboriginal women in particular. Now, we have expertise that we would like to share with you thanks to many of our association members. We are part of a network of associations from across Canada, and they are all affected by this situation and by this injustice. Now, there are First Nations women, Métis women, and there are also Inuit women who are a part of our association. Today, I'm not here to be their voice, but rather to be a tool in order to make sure that their voices are heard in amendments to this bill. Now, our position today is really that you need to understand that our association supports human rights and advocates for the human rights of Aboriginal women. It is very important. As you know, after many years, Canada endorsed the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. And it is from that perspective that we want to speak to you about the importance of this issue that I think is so unfortunate. We need to make sure that Canada will seriously consider these clauses, will look at them sincerely, and make sure that they are dealt with fairly. Now, the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples speaks to the importance of member states making sure that living conditions of women are always taken into consideration on the social level and economic level, but also from the perspective of housing. We need to make sure that they have access to housing, to education, and we need to make sure that they live free from violence, whether that be economic violence, domestic violence, violence in any shape or form. Indigenous women also have dreams, I am proud to be an Indigenous woman, and we have dreams. We have dreams of making sure that we're not just going to be part of the statistics for murdered and missing women, imprisoned women, women living in extreme poverty. There's a common thread here that I see. And our association, though, cannot change it alone unless there is the political will on the part of the federal government to change that, and on the part of the provincial and territorial and municipal governments. We have the dreams of having economic opportunity that is equal to that of our Canadian sisters throughout this huge country. So when you talk about prosperity, well, Aboriginal women aren't part of that dream of prosperity, and it's so unfortunate because we all live side by side. Now, when we take position on issues, or when we act, or when we recommend action, men are part of those recommendations, children and elders are part of those recommendations, because as Aboriginal women, we have huge hearts and everyone is included. You have to be a part of our dream. Another dream of mine, a dream that I have for my 5 children and for all the women I work with on a daily basis, is to make sure that whether I live in Vancouver, whether I live in Montreal, or whether I live in Thunder Bay, that I will be able to walk safely. Because there is also racial violence against Aboriginal women. I want to be able to walk in a country where there is peace, where peace is a part of our daily lives, and where violence is not a part of our daily lives, where it's eradicated, just like racism should be. Now, oftentimes we view prostitution as a choice. People say that it is the oldest job in the world, that it's a choice and we have a right to that choice. Well, I have listened to many women throughout Canada, friends, family members, and people I had never met before speaking to them, and I'm referring here to Aboriginal women. That is the beauty of working for our association. We have an opportunity to meet so many people. None of those women have ever told me that this was their choice. Not one. Now, I'm not saying I've met all Aboriginal women, but I would tell you that if you were to say to any of those women that for the same salary, they could have a decent job, they could have a job that was free of violence, well, they would all say that they would take that job. Now, when we've met women, when we've listened to women, and when we've done our own research amongst these women, we have learned that most of them have been victims of human trafficking. So just imagine. From our perspective, this bill does have flaws, but it also has strengths. And it's important that we speak to them, and I hope that my colleague will be able to go into greater detail. But what I would say is that criminalizing Aboriginal women, because they are a part of this bill, obviously, criminalizing women is of great concern to us.
More than 40% of Aboriginal women in prison have been to Indian residential schools. More than that have been placed in care or have parents who went to Indian residential schools. Trends have been identified that show that Aboriginal girls are forced into situations or to use coping strategies that increase their vulnerability to violence, such as hitchhiking, addiction, unsafe housing, or homeless, prostitution, gang involvement, trafficking, sexual exploitation, and being in abused relationships. We know that Aboriginal girls and women are involved in prostitution have a higher risk of being targeted by traffickers. This means that they may be moved from their Aboriginal community or urban environment and forced to perform sex work either domestically or internationally. NWAC advocate for the Nordic model here in Canada because we see equality between women and men. Another reason is because of the link between prostitution and trafficking. It is Aboriginal girls and women who are specifically targeted in this country to be trafficked in such huge number that it does not compare to other population, and the average age of girls being trafficked are between 7 and 12 years old here in Canada.
And I'll take over from here. Why are Aboriginal women at risk? Well, violence can take on many forms: physical, sexual, emotional, psychological, spiritual, cultural, and financial. And it often results in the vulnerability and self-harm, depression, cycle of violence, alcohol and drug addiction, abuse, suicide. Aboriginal women are 8 times more likely to be killed than non-Aboriginal women. The rates of spousal assault are more than 3 times higher than non-Aboriginal women. And please note here that many Aboriginal women are not married to Aboriginal men, so don't make the assumption that it's Aboriginal men that are killing their spouses. It's often not the case at all. Aboriginal women experience more severe and potentially life-threatening forms of spousal violence, 54% versus the 37% of non-Aboriginal women, and the violence is likely to go unreported in more than 60% of those cases. NWAC knows that violence is often linked to circumstances of vulnerability that Michelle spoke about: the low income, the housing insecurity, their age, geography where they're located, the fact that they're women, and the effects of when all other factors are controlled. Aboriginal people are still 3 times more likely to experience violence than non-Aboriginal people. Prostitution exploits women and increases the inequalities based on their gender, race, age, disability, and poverty. We know there's a link between the many missing and murdered Aboriginal women to trafficking, or who have been linked to sexual exploitation and who are prostituted. That's why it's so necessary that groups such as NWAC keep raising the high rates of missing and murdered women, asking for a public inquiry, and calling on all Canadians to stand united to legally compel the government to develop a comprehensive plan of action that will truly make a difference in the lives of women and girls. We must stand united with the coalition on the abolition of prostitution so that we can send a message to society that we want more than prostitution for Aboriginal women and for future generations. We want more for Aboriginal women who are in prostitution and who are being trafficked. We want real options for all women and all girls. We have so many beautiful opportunities to support and encourage one another, to lead, to build a society where women are valued, and to foster social and economic security among Aboriginal communities. And we know that these Aboriginal women, when we invest in them, they invest in their family and their community. It's a worthwhile investment. We have to send the message to Canadians that we want more for women than for them to be for sale and for them to be disposable. Entrepreneurship and small business development is an ongoing trend in Canadian society, especially among Aboriginal women. These women can make an enormous contribution to Canada if they're engaged in the economy and not in prostitution. Our women are the youngest, fastest growing community in Canadian labor force that's rapidly aging. Our successful contribution to the economy and real business opportunities would be Canada's success. Our future is Canada's future. Closing the education and employment gaps for our people would contribute $400 billion to the national economy and save $115 billion in expenditures, and would promote the safety and well-being of our women and their families. I know I'm running out of time, so I'll just say, despite the many social and economic challenges that Aboriginal women have and continue to face, we have shown significant resiliency. Aboriginal women are powerful, resourceful, hardworking, determined, detail-oriented, with a vision for the future, which includes supporting their family and community, as I mentioned. This strength is an important and necessary trait to achieve success, so I know that we can do it. Now, we need the government to support actions that will promote equality for all women. Together, we can continue to strive for the economic security, safety, and well-being for our women and girls. It's up to us, to all of us, to breathe life into implementing the rights outlined in the UN Declaration. We have to take a position in favor of abolishing prostitution and passing abolitionist legislation to convey a clear message. We must ensure that we deliver new hope and new opportunity to our women and girls, and that we do so by creating safety and economic prosperity. Thank you.
Much. Thank you for that presentation from the Native Women's Association of Canada. Our next presenter is from Rising Angels. Ms. McLeod, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Good afternoon. My name is Katarina McLeod, and I would just like to thank all of you for having me here to speak, and especially Joyce Smith and the fight that she has done to bring this here, not only for women like me, but for our up-and-coming generations. I am a founder of Rising Angels. Rising Angels is an organization that helps women who want to exit the sex trade by offering support and mentoring them. I was trapped in the sex trade for 15 years. In those years, I was subjected to all kinds of different abuse. I was anally raped, spat on, had my jaw dislocated, my hair pulled, been punched, and the list goes on. I feel it is important for you to know that I was 21 years of age when I entered. I was attending a support group for women who were being abused, and in that group I met a woman who owned a massage parlor, and she offered me a job. At the time, I believed I was making a free and conscious decision, but now on the other side of it, I realized that because of my life prior to entering the sex trade, that just wasn't the case. I had been sexually abused as a child and abused by many men as a young woman, something that clouded my judgment and ability to make healthy choices. I had no sense of self-worth and was used to being taken against my will, so getting paid seemed like a good deal. I have known and worked with hundreds of girls in the industry and have not met one girl who did not suffer some form of abuse before entering into the sex trade. If you grow up in a good home where morals and self-worth are instilled into you, or where if there are forms of abuse that you do get help for dealing with the trauma, you would never choose to sell your body to a man for money. It just doesn't make sense. I know there are some who claim that this is a choice for them to prostitute. I get that. 5 years ago, I would have said the same thing. Because my prostitution was my livelihood, it was my normal. It was all I knew, and I felt I could not do any better. If I had admitted to myself or anyone else what I was doing was wrong and that it was destroying me, the shame would have taken over, and I would not have been able to do what I felt I needed to do to survive and feed my kids. I am excited that for the first time in Canadian history, women in prostitution will be looked at as victims instead of criminals. That Canada is recognizing that prostitution is violence against women, that it is the most vulnerable women who enter into the sex trade. Section 2861 of the bill will for the first time hold the buyers accountable, and they will be subject to fines or jail time for buying sex. I support this. Because I know prostitution is about supply and demand, and when the demand is taken away, the supply will follow. I do believe, however, we need to be consistent in the consequences of repeat offenders, and the punishment should be jail time. A person who knows that their actions could cause them to lose their freedom will think twice before committing the crime. I do believe that in conjunction with a fine for first-time offenders, there should be a mandatory John School. I have taught in John Schools across Ontario for many years, and I can tell you this fight is about changing the mindset of men. Men truly believe that prostitution is a case of two consenting adults. They have no clue why or how women enter to begin with, or the domino effect that it has not only on the women and her kids, but on the John and his family. After I speak in John Schools, I have men coming up to me and apologizing, some of them even crying. John Schools should be key in educating the men who buy sex. 2862, material benefit from sexual services. I am very pleased with this section of the bill because nobody would be able to benefit from selling off another human being. I am concerned, though, that Terry Jean Bedford has brought forward to allow women to hire bodyguards or drivers. In my experience, these so-called drivers or bodyguards have always been pimps. So I'm concerned that this bill will allow an exception for these kind of services. There is no way to make prostitution safe. This is what needs to be understood. No panic button, no amount of time will be able to screen your client beforehand. Nothing. Unless you are going to hire a third party to be with you at all times while you are turning tricks, ensuring safety is impossible. My concern with this is that I have worked in legal brothels and massage parlors where every time a client came in, I had to pay a fee to the house. To me, this is pimping. If you pay someone any money for sexual services, they are getting a material gain. So I would like to see these owners and operators held accountable. The bill proposes a new section, 213, which makes it an offense to communicate for the purpose of providing sexual services for consideration in a public place, that is or is next to a place where minors might reasonably be expected to be present. This law will protect our children, because where there is prostitution, pimps, johns, and traffickers are not far behind. I know one of the big arguments against the communication law is that if women could screen their clients beforehand, then they would be able to protect themselves better. as if in a short period of time, women would be able to determine if their potential client was a psycho or not. This is ludicrous. As children, we are taught about stranger danger, but most often the monster isn't a stranger you have to watch out for. Just as my clients I have seen have been stand-up people in the community, but that didn't mean they were not capable of hurting me. It's only when you are alone servicing them that you will truly know their intentions. It was inside legal brothels where most of my abuse from customers occurred. My only issue with this section of the bill is that, again, the most vulnerable are at risk, and by that I mean the prostitutes who work on the street, because this is how they do their business. You have to understand that these women will not move inside, that most of them have huge addictions and mental health issues. A lot of them are homeless or just doing a trick for the next fix. These women will not be hired or able to work indoors because a lot of them are too far gone. My fear with the way the bill is written is that these women will be criminalized and giving fines that they will only have to service more men to pay. There has to be a diversion program. This is mandatory. This has to be mandatory, like a Jane school that lasts longer than a day. These women don't see the dangers or don't have the ability to care because they are in survival mode. So we somehow as Canadians have to help them without criminalizing them, because that will just hinder any progress they may have later in their life. If they are able to exit this life, a criminal record will make it harder for them to return to school or get a job. In the advertising sexual services, this section of the bill is a huge success in many areas. We live in a world where everything is sexualized, where you can open a paper or a magazine and go on Backpage and see all kinds of explicit content. Not to mention the media and how they play a role in minimizing sexual exploitation of women. We need this not to be accessible. We need to make a shift in not only society's view on women, but of the up-and-coming generation. The only issue I have with this is, how are you going to know it's an independent woman who is posting and not a pimp or a trafficker? You won't. We have been trained, some of us, what to look for, like the lingo, the wording, and the pictures. So my fear is if no one is constantly monitoring these sites, no one will truly know. Lastly, I am encouraged by the government's commitment to allot $20 million to be used for education and exiting programs. If there is one thing I have learned in my journey, that it is really difficult to leave prostitution and go back into mainstream society. You need to help to relearn things that have been taken away from you. I myself had to learn self-worth, how to speak properly, education, even the simplest way of knowing how to dress. This so-called profession changes your whole makeup, and who you once were is lost. So women exiting need our help and support in relearning who they are and how to be. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. McLeod, for that from the Rising Angels. Our next presenters are both individual presenters, but they're both on video conference. And the next one that we will hear from is the Canadian Association of Elizabeth Fry Societies, and Kim Pate is the Executive Director, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and I want to start also by acknowledging the traditional territory on which I am currently and in which you are meeting. As most of you know, I normally reside on Algonquin territory, right where you are, and this issue is very much linked to, as you've already heard from our colleagues at the Native Women's Association of Canada, to the ongoing impact of colonization, in particular on our Indigenous women. I have worked for the past 30 years, first with young people, then with men, and for almost 23 years now with this organization, with women who have been marginalized, victimized, criminalized, and institutionalized. It's work that has brought me every year in contact with this issue, even though my life's work was not working with those involved in prostitution. In essence, it has become thus. Through this period, I have lived with, worked with, and walked with young people, men and women, who have been prostituted and who have been criminalized largely for their involvement as individuals who are being paid for sex. this, to me, is a fundamental equality issue. It's a fundamental issue also of violence against women. And our view is that it cannot be the view of our organization, our members right across Canada. As you know, we are in throughout the country working everything from early intervention programs with young people and families to prison and exiting, and in mental health settings, as well as with homeless and addicted and individuals with mental health issues. Throughout this period, our organization has worked to try and both challenge the victimization of women and their criminalization. And we see this move, the move to decriminalize women, as fundamental to women's equality. We also see it as fundamental to women's equality that violence against women continue to be addressed. It's not in my lifetime that women stopped being the property of the men who married them or who fathered them. But it is in my lifetime that we had husbands, as has already been mentioned by our colleague from the London Rape Crisis Center. It is in my working lifetime, that husbands were told they could no longer rape women. And I think it is high time that we now say it is not okay for men to buy and sell women and children in this country. And that part of this legislation, we think it is an important step forward. But without adequate social services, economic services, legal supports and services, a law alone will not make women equal, nor will it end violence against women, nor will it expand the choices that are available to them. Some have raised the concern, and because I'm not going to repeat some of what has already been raised by individuals on this panel before us, but one of the issues that has been raised is that this bill will not, that the charter will not, this bill will not, succeed a charter analysis. In fact, the charter does not protect the right, nor should it protect the right of men to buy women for sex, nor should it protect the rights of individuals who seek to profit from the exploitation of women and children. The provisions of C-36 that would criminalize women, however, we do not support, and certainly would like to suggest to the committee that those provisions that involve any component of criminalizing the women, whether it be for advertising or for being involved in street prostitution, be removed from the bill. We see law and public policies, as well as other economic and social equality issues, need to be developed in order to ensure that the majority of women and children who are involved in prostitution, because they have little or no other choice, are provided with real options to exit. And, one of the challenges that I've heard is many times is that, in fact, there is scientific report that, in fact, there is no harm created by the prostitution industry. In fact, we know from countless other approaches, whether it be the challenges that have been made historically to issues about violence against women, that in fact those kinds of lobbying to argue for lack of harm, when in fact the evidence is blatantly there, and in fact those who have argued, in my experience, both privately and publicly, have in other contexts understood and recognized and acknowledged the implicit harm and violence that those involved in prostitution face. So in terms of, in summary, some of the concerns we have and some of what we would like to see focused on, we would like to see that there be an overarching description that just because prostitution has been widespread, it should not be accepted as inevitable. That the 2005 trafficking provisions that were put in place are not sufficient, and those could be shorn up. That the new offense of selling sexual services in a public place where a young person might be present or might be reasonably expected to be present be removed. We see that as a particular concern for the women with whom we work, in particular Indigenous women, poor women, women with addictions, women with mental health issues, and we see it as absolutely inconsistent with the notion of decriminalizing women within this context. We also have concerns regarding the issue of what will happen in terms of those women who are forced to prostitute within their own homes. Our view is that even though many of the women we work with have been criminalized, many of them also are struggling to support their families and their children with limited options, and they should not be criminalized because they have those limited options. And some of these provisions, I think, also risk doing further criminalizing women. We also are extremely concerned that, in fact, women, that although monies are being earmarked, $20 million, that is precious little when we look at the overall need for things like guaranteed livable incomes, adequate and affordable housing, adequate and affordable child care, alcohol and drug treatment options, more rape crisis shelters and women's centers. And we feel that very much this bill will be ineffective if, in fact, those resources are not also put in place, because to not have those resources in place means to actually relegate women to further to the margins and provide them with even fewer options to exit for those who wish to exit. And we would agree that our experience has been many women, while they're in the trade, although will be characterized as having chosen that, when they're provided with options to exit, do. The other piece that, and I know that one of the challenges for our organization is that we see very clearly that there is a need to ensure there are adequate supports for women in order to exit. One of the realities is we also need some fundamental education about what is and is not legal at the moment, regardless of what the law is now. We have been increasingly concerned, and in fact have taken a very strong position on this issue as of 2008, in large part because we started to see women who are being criminalized who believed that men were not only just entitled to buy and sell sex from them, but they were entitled to buy and sell the right to degrade them. And we have far too many examples of some of the most brutalizing, some of the most disadvantaged and desperate women facing some of the most brutalizing and worst conditions. And the examples of what happened in terms of the number of women that Picton was able to pick up, and some of the work that's been done in the downtown east side that showed that men who could afford to purchase sex from much more expensive services, escorts, could even afford to go to destination brothels such as other countries, were not choosing to go there because they were actually seeking out some of the most marginalized and desperate individual women, because they were seeking to buy the right to abuse. In their minds, there is no right, obviously, but they were seeking to buy women to, in fact, abuse, degrade, and as some of you know, there are many examples of situations where men have beaten and obviously killed women, and so there's also evidence that that is in fact part of what gets promoted by an industry that is encouraged to be seen as legalized and decriminalized. Finally, I would say that any provision that calls for mandatory minimum sentences of any sort, we do not support. We do not see that as necessary. We see as necessary the naming of the behavior as criminal and the progressive education and the added supports and services that need to be put in place so that women are not put at risk, women and children are not put at risk and put in situations to be in increasing disadvantage. And so I look forward to the questions of the committee, and I'd like to also take the opportunity, because I know she's incredibly humble and never introduces herself in a way that perhaps and is not known to many of you, but my colleague Deborah Kilroy, who's here from Sisters Inside, and we happen to be in meetings here in New York together, as she's here on a Churchill Fellowship, and she was in Canada, and some of you met with her when she was in Canada, and went across the country, has been throughout the United States as well, looking at alternatives to incarceration, in particular for women, and in particular for racialized women. But what you may not know about her is she's a woman who also has lived experience, who I've known for and worked with for almost 2 decades now, and but in addition to having that lived experience, started an organization called Sisters Inside in Australia to work with women who were exiting all kinds of precarious situations, including prison, including those who have been in violent situations, prostitution, on the street. And she is now a lawyer and runs a law firm as well out of Sisters Inside. She has been awarded one of the highest human rights award in her country, the Australian Human Rights Medal, as well as the Order of Australia, and she has also completed postgraduate work in forensic mental health, and in fact was the impetus for me doing some of that work. And so I know that Mr. Chair, I don't want to supplant your role, but I just wanted to say a few words about Deborah Kilroy before she speaks.
Thank you, Ms. Petty. And now we are going to hear from Sisters Inside, and Ms. Kilroy, the floor is yours for 10 minutes.
Thank you, Chair. Before I speak today, I do want to acknowledge that we are on traditional land of Aboriginal people, not only here in New York City, but where you are, and I reside on stolen Nullarbor land, which is south of Brisbane in Queensland, Australia. It's important for me to acknowledge the First Peoples of our countries and where we travel, and acknowledge the colonisation that has occurred and the impact of such colonisation as we see played out when we walk into our prison gates of the women's prisons, children's prisons, men's prisons, and see the impact of that colonisation that has violated and abused Aboriginal people, the First Peoples. And so I want to acknowledge that history. Thank you for allowing me to speak today and contribute. I'd like to say that the hearings of the Standing Committee of Justice and Human Rights on Bill C-36 has had evidence presented and media reports that have been very divisive, even to the extent, particularly in social media, where there's been comments made that have been dismissive and harmful to women with lived experience in the prostitution industry and those who take an opposing views from others. This conversation and debate needs to be respectful and not abusive, and I encourage those that want to take sides that we actually need to find some common ground, because what I'm talking about and who I'm talking about and for are women who are the most disadvantaged women of all. Not women that come from a class that think they are making specific choices, but women that are forced into the prostitution industry because they have no other choice and it's the only way they're surviving. So we need to be respectful in our conversations. We would all agree that stopping violence against women and girls is fundamental, and that's where our starting point has to be, to ensure violence against women and girls is eradicated and equality for all women and girls is ensured. So how do we get there? Some say more legal sanctions and some say no legal sanctions. The reality is that we already have laws in all countries around the world to address violence against women and girls, and we know that violence is continually perpetrated against women and girls daily around the world. We don't argue, debate, lobby to decriminalise these acts of violence against women and girls, and we don't demand that the violators are not held accountable, because that would be unthinkable. So why do we argue to decriminalise the acts of violence experienced by women and girls who are violated in the prostitution industry? Women must have avenues to hold men accountable who violate them. It is then the woman's choice to report or not, but they have a choice. Total decriminalisation gives women and girls no choice. As a woman at home who I spoke to recently, who is a woman that has been bought and sold throughout her life, and we were discussing Bill C-36, and she said to me, if you take away a woman's right to hold men accountable, it's the same as taking away a woman's right to report any form of abuse. Free market capitalism is not the answer and will not stop violence against women and girls. Prostitution relies on and enforces inequality and disadvantage. The gendered nature of the prostitution industry is in fact evidence that prostitution is a practice of inequality. Legalised prostitution is government-sanctioned abuse of women and girls and violates their rights to equality and safety. Aboriginal peoples are the most exploited peoples in the world, and if we decriminalise the prostitution industry, we will ensure that Aboriginal women and girls are even more vulnerable to prostitution and trafficking. The violence Aboriginal women in Canada experience is parallel to the experiences of violence that Aboriginal women experience in Australia, and we want more for Aboriginal women. We want more for all women. Prostituting women does not make us equal. It consigns us to poverty, psychological and physical trauma, verbal and sexual abuse, and high rates of homicide. Violence against women and girls must stop. I wanted to be brief and make the statements that I've made to influence you to ensure that women and girls are not criminalised in this bill in any form, especially women and girls who are the most disadvantaged in your country. They need support, social services, and I would agree with other speakers that more money needs to be supported and provided for social services for women who are disadvantaged, so they do have access to other incomes, to jobs, to housing, to education and to health. This is fundamental. And in conclusion, what I'd like to do is dedicate my evidence today to a dear friend who, while I've been away travelling on this Churchill Fellowship, was found beaten and murdered a few weeks ago. And she was a woman that was bought and sold regularly. So we are talking about women who are in the darkest places and who are being abused and who are being killed. This needs to be addressed. We need to not decriminalise. We need to hold men, pimps, Johns accountable for their violation of women. We are not commodities. We are human beings and we deserve to be treated as such. Violence against women and girls must stop. Women and girls' lives are too valuable to me, and hopefully our lives, women's lives, girls' lives are valuable to you too. Thank you.
Thank you for that presentation, and that concludes our witnesses' presentations. We now go to the rounds of questions, and our first questioner from the New Democratic Party is Madame Boivin.
Merci.
Thank you very much to all of you for your presentations. They were extremely interesting. Dealing with a file that is difficult. Trying to get rid of prostitution entirely is difficult. This image of women who are abused, it's very difficult. When it comes, spousal abuse is a difficult issue. Income inequality, poverty, they are difficult issues. I was listening to your presentation, Madame Odette, and statistics that are extremely worrisome. Prostitution, in my books, is an important part, but it is an element among many others when it comes to injustices that women and Aboriginal women face. Sometimes we have to start somewhere. That's probably what you'll say to me. However, we have to act correctly. We have to act logically. It's important for us to hear from you, to hear you very strongly. I know that you are all supporters of the Nordic model. It would be important to say to the Conservative government that for the Nordic model to work, it takes social measures. I know that this is a good start, C36, but in my opinion, we're going to hit a wall if we do not put those two components together. The fact that we see prostitutes, and I will accept your vocabulary in order to avoid launching a discussion with Ms. Walker, even though I love having discussions with her. I don't have enough time to have them this afternoon. If these women are victims, the fact that they are being criminalized, if the Conservatives do not accept the amendments to decriminalize completely, according to what Madame Pate said, my question is as follows for every single one of you. Do you still support Bill C-36? I would like you to send a strong message, the message that you are sending right now. With all the respect that I have for you and all the admiration I have for each and every one of you, it is not very strong. Because I know how our Conservative friends work. they're going to say, hey, everyone congratulated us for that $20 million. That's what I'm hearing from you, because you're just expressing a small reserve. But as women, can we stand up and say that if we want to talk, put your money where your mouth is? $20 million is a farce. I want to hear you about that. If there's not a commitment before we even get to clause by clause, I would at least like to hear you. If we continue to criminalize women, that you insist our victims that you will not support Bill C-36. Help us help you if you want us to amend this bill. Because otherwise, when you're no longer there and we proceed to clause by clause, what we're going to hear is everybody said we're awesome.
That's why I want to know from the people who support the bill, but support not that much. So ball is on your camp. Kim, I want to know if you still support, if they don't amend in the sense of what you said, if 20 million is still there, and it's an easy yes or no, please.
So we'll start with Ms. Pate, since you pointed her out. You go first.
Yeah, just go like this.
Sure. Yeah, thank you for asking. I thought I was clear, so if it wasn't clear enough, and I think I've been very clear in every presentation I've made on prostitution, this is not a legal response only. It has to be married with the economic supports. As I say, we talk about a guaranteed livable income. It has to be linked to adequate and affordable housing. It has to be linked to adequate and affordable childcare. It has to be linked to alcohol and drug treatment, and it has to be linked to monies for the independent women's movement, which have essentially been eviscerated, as has social services and healthcare. And I thought I was clear that I said we do not support anything that criminalizes, that could criminalize women.
You were the clearer, but I started with you just to give you an opportunity to add on the 20 million.
Ms. Kilroy, do you have a comment to the question?
I agree with Ms. Pate. It has to go hand in hand. The law is not our saviour. It is about services that need to be provided to people that are marginalised and disadvantaged, that we do have access to accommodation, health, education, and a guaranteed income. These are all very important. The law will not protect us or set us free as one piece of a framework. We need to look at social services across the board for all our members of society. So 20 million, it wouldn't even touch the sides. And I suppose what happens in Australia, which is concerning, when money is allocated, it usually goes to law enforcement, and that does not assist. That actually criminalises more women and girls.
Ms. McLeod?
I personally want to see these women decriminalized on all areas, because it does come down to having these things available for them, that they can go to social agencies and have the help that they need, and the exit programs available. And yes, $20 million is a drop in a bucket, but it's a beginning, and that's more than we've had.
Ms. Walker?
It's a great question, and it's a question that we have debated in our office. I'm sorry, am I too close?
No, somebody's BlackBerry or phone or something's close to a microphone.
So
Megan.
that would be
It's
me.
Megan's fault.
Yeah, it is, as always. But now it's way far away. It is I don't think it is me, really. Is it? How? Okay, I don't truly believe that's me. It is a question we've debated in our office as well with the women we serve and our board and volunteers and staff. And first of all, I'm very hopeful to see women decriminalized. I'm hopeful that there will be an amendment to that. And we're going to continue to push towards that until the very end. But our board of directors has made a decision to support the bill, even if that is not eliminated. And the example that has been used by our board is that of domestic violence and the legislation around mandatory charging, or the regulations around mandatory charging. At that time, our agency actually advocated for separate legislation for victims of domestic violence, which would recognize that situation. And we were asked at the time if we would still support the mandatory charging, and we said yes, even though it didn't go far enough.
J'aime beaucoup la question de François.
I really like Françoise's question, Françoise, I believe, is your name. I've been involved for 20 years in politics with Aboriginal women, and I think since 2006 with the Conservatives. And their approach seems to be this all or nothing. We have tried to communicate with the minister. We knew that our request for a national inquiry had been completely turned down by the Conservatives, but we are proactive as an organization. We are women of action, and so we suggested that we set up a type of roundtable where various departments sit down with NWAC and speak about prevention, for example, and the issue of prostitution, of women who have been prostituted. And we wanted that to be part of a socioeconomic action plan. So we wanted a national action plan. Now, from our perspective, $20 million is peanuts. We are very, very far behind for Aboriginals, especially for Aboriginal women. So it's going to be very difficult to divide up this pie. However, I feel that with the round table, and I feel that with our friends in the Conservative government sitting down at the table and with what NWAC has proposed on missing and murdered Aboriginal women, with this round table, as I was saying, there could be a dialogue between Aboriginal women and this government. And this issue could be taken into consideration. And that is essential, absolutely essential. Now, if you'd asked me the question when I was 18 years old, I would have said, no, I completely reject this. But now I'm 42, and I know how things work within a government. Sometimes what you have to do is swallow hard and use your energy to forge ahead, to continue lobbying, to make sure that the momentum is maintained. And I've made this a personal issue, as you all know. Thank you very much
for that round. Now we go to the Conservative Party and Mrs. Smith.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I have two questions that that has been coming back to me all the time, and I want to start with Megan Walker, please. You know, I hear that meet the nice, normal Johns of Canada. They're nice people, and prostitution is an industry, and you're just servicing the Johns. Could you make comment about what you know about the nice Johns?
It's interesting you asked that question. Okay, I am not doing anything. I don't have the earpiece. What is
powerful. That's it.
I'm not sure what's happening. I am electric. Are we good now? Okay. There's this amazing project that actually started in Europe, and it's the Invisible Man Project. And actually yesterday it was released in Canada on social media. And it's this phenomenal project which shows the Invisible Man, the white mask, with actual dialogue from Johns about what they have said about their experiences with prostituted women or with women. And I printed one off yesterday just so I could relay what Johns are saying. These are like the good guys, these wonderful men that are buying women, and I thought it would be interesting to relay information to you about one man. There are lots of them available on Twitter if you go to Invisible Man Project, or on Facebook. But this is in the words of a John. She is black, no, Métis, no blue eyes. Pictures are either very well done or it is not her. Hard to tell. At some point, I realized that she is a bit slow. That made me feel like a jackass. Serviced myself quickly and left. I felt so ashamed that I think that I will need some time to recover. I mean, having sex with a handicap is a new low. Right down there with having sex with a pregnant crack whore. Laugh out loud. But that's what happens when you don't take your time hunting and putting the effort. Instead of getting a fox, you get a rat. And this is a perfect example of what men, Johns, buyers, punters, whatever you'd like to call them, feel about women in prostitution.
Yes, when we talk about it being an industry, that's what these women daily face. Now, Katrina, we've always, we keep saying, in the sex industry, they need everything legalized because they have to screen their clients. So can you tell us about screening the clients, and can you tell us about your feelings about criminalizing the perpetrators, criminalizing the buying of sex, those two things?
Okay, so first I'm going to address the screening the clients. I think is it's ridiculous. There is no way in a short matter of a time to decide whether or not that customer is a stand-up person or if he's not going to go crazy in a room or attack you. You have to understand it's when you're behind closed doors, whether it's car doors, hotel room doors, I don't care. That's where you're going to know what's really going on here. That's when the client is going to let his true colors out, show you what he wants, or that's where I've seen a lot of violence occur, is if he pays for something that you're not comfortable doing, then they become violent. So I don't think in a matter of 5 or 10 minutes you're going to be able to tell what anybody's intentions are. So I think that's just a load of baloney. Sorry, what was your next question?
Perpetrators are criminalizing. For the first time in Canada, we are making the buying of sex illegal.
I think that's an amazing stand that we're willing to take, because men have for so long gotten away with buying women like we're burgers. You can order us at the drive-through of what you want on your burger. You know, it's the same as you can order a blonde, a brunette, size, height, all of that stuff. And this has been allowed to go on forever. And my fears with this going like that is we have an up-and-coming generation of boys who are so exposed to all of the sexualization in media. I mean, my son is 12 years old and he's already been exposed to pornography through his friends on his iPhone. This is what we're seeing. 20 years ago, pornography was not as violent as it is today. Now, it's about violent and making women hurt when you're having sex with them. And this is what our kids and the men are starting to think is normal. So I really think that the men need to be held accountable to realize that people aren't commodities, that you can't just buy and sell human beings, period.
Thank you. And I have a question for NWAC, an association which I have great respect for. My son is RCMP, married to an Ojibwa girl, and he speaks Ojibwa and Soto, actually. And I've had a lot of interaction with the Aboriginal population. My baby grands are half and half. So having said that, I was very interested when you wisely said it takes some time, you start to build and gain the momentum. Do you feel as an organization that Bill C-36 is a really good first step to build that momentum and build on that and go in the right direction? What are your feelings about it?
We'll share that time.
Okay.
And you gain some feathers with your family.
Thank you. Can I tell you I have the red shawl too then? I do.
Je vais répondre en français.
I'm going to answer in French with your permission, because it's difficult for me to use the vocabulary around this issue in English. Now, you've brought a bill forward, and I would say it's not perfect. Let's call a spade a spade. It's not perfect. But knowing that people who are involved in the sex trade and use it are going to be criminalized is a giant step. However, I want to make sure, I want to know that women and Aboriginal women will not be criminalized. We have Aboriginal women who are the poorest women in Canada. We all know that. And a considerable amount of research has shown this. They are the most vulnerable. They have to feed their family, they may have to feed an addiction, and therefore they may be involved in the kind of environment that falls under this bill and therefore might be criminalized. So I would ask you to consider everything that Aboriginal women have to face: racism, discrimination, extreme poverty, violence, systemic violence. So please take that into consideration. Use that lens for the good of your grandchildren, for the good of the rest of Canada.
Again, just to add to what Michelle said, we want to see a holistic approach to this. We want to see economic development, all the Aboriginal economic development that this government is making into Aboriginal community is largely benefiting men. We want the social supports in place for women to access training, skill building, and have true options for livable income rather than prostitution. And we need to send that message to Canadians that Aboriginal women are not disposable and they're worth more, as are your grandchildren. So we need to see see the government put their money where the mouth is for the supports for a future for Aboriginal women and girls.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for those questions and answers. Our next questioner from the Liberal Party is Mr. Casey.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just want to pick up right where Ms. Smith left off. Do you see in this legislation particular attention paid to the uniquely vulnerable situation that First Nations find themselves in?
I wouldn't say that there's particular attention. If you did a search of the Act, you're not even seeing the word Aboriginal. So yes, that is obviously a concern for us. But as Michelle said, it's not a perfect bill, but we have to start with something. And we can't risk the advances that we could make in criminalizing pimps, johns, and traffickers in this legislation.
The measures that you would recommend to achieve those goals or to progress towards those goals, can you identify them in terms of what else you would like to see in the bill to address those specific concerns? Or am I to understand that to work towards where we need to be, that these aren't necessarily legislative matters but budgetary?
You're giving us an opportunity here to speak. So what I would say is that prevention has to be done. Prostitution is an outcome of colonialism, many things. You all know that. Murdered women, same. Missing women, same. Violence, same. So if you want to be proactive, I think that in terms of measures, you need to make sure that Aboriginal women, Inuit women, be able to have the dialogue. So our association, Paktutit as well, be able to have that dialogue with the government. And if you can do that, that's a giant step. Why? Because that will make departments implement concrete measures. We shouldn't have to always come and complain before you in a room here. Well, that's not in the bill. And you haven't heard the intention to do that, have you? Well, perhaps the question should be put to your colleagues opposite.
The Chiefs of Ontario have raised the issue of the United Nations Charter and duty on the part of the government to consult where First Nations communities are so uniquely vulnerable. Do you share their view, or would you care to comment on it?
Go ahead. We would encourage the implementation of the UN Declaration in its entirety, which also asks for the right for women to live free from violence and to have economic security. So it wouldn't be merely, you can't just hive off the duty to consult alone. Of course, that's always necessary when you're having any legislation that affects Aboriginal peoples in such a way. But as we mentioned, as we framed our entire argument, we said we would like to see the UN Declaration and all its articles implemented.
Does the legislative measures taken in C-36 respect the Declaration?
Well, in the sense there's no reference to it, if that's what you mean. I mean, there's no specific reference to it, no.
And, Madame Odette, on ne peut pas entendre votre...
Ms. Odette, could we please hear what you have to say? Well, we're very visual, and so that's why you read the expression on my face. But now, to continue in the oral tradition, I'll say no. In the bill, Aboriginal, the word Aboriginal is not specifically written down, referred to. And I think you still have the power to do this, along with your colleagues in the Conservative government. And if not...
You were so alive. No, we have... I think here a great opportunity to make sure that, yes, Canadian women are facing this or presenting, or we have great speaker here, but here in Canada, Aboriginal women are so alive, so proud, but so resilient that now you have the chance to make sure that real action also are towards specifically for Aboriginal women. Not that I want to take something away from my sisters, but you know that there is a big, big gap. You know that the UNDRIP is there. You can use some of it or all of it. Why not? But make sure that the dialogue is with Pauktutik, NWAC, and at the grassroots to make sure that what you're doing today, in 10, 20 years, my daughters won't open a newspaper and say, well, Mom, I want to work in the sex trade. No, Mom, I want to be a pilot. Mom, I want to be a doctor or a teacher or an MP.
Finally, I'd be interested in your opinion as to the intersection of Bill C-36 with the Gladue principles of the Supreme Court of Canada in 1999. Do you have an opinion as to whether there is a relationship between the two? What comment can you offer as to whether or not C-36 pays respect to what the Supreme Court of Canada had to say in Gladue?
Definitely, I would like to see more respect paid to the Gladue principles. Obviously, the last thing that we would want to see is Aboriginal women or any of the most marginalized women impacted by criminalization. And I think we've been very clear about that throughout. So that is one area that we need to see change happen, and we'll continue to advocate for that change, because it is our worst fear that would happen, that more women, rather than the pimps and traffickers, will be charged, that it will be the most low-hanging fruit, not to ever compare a woman to commodify them further, but just to say, because they're already marginalized, it'd be easy to arrest and criminalize them. That's the last thing we would want to see happen with this legislation. So we've told you what we do want in the legislation, and we've expressed clearly that we don't want the criminalization of women. And particularly, we have enough Aboriginal women that are being criminalized every day. The numbers are increasing, as many presenters have stated, and we would not want to see this as another measure to criminalize Aboriginal women.
Another question?
Ms. Pate, you emphatically stated the position of your organization against mandatory minimum sentences. Why?
Well, because there has been no evidence, and certainly we've had an abundance, especially recently, of legislation that has increased numbers of mandatory minimum sentences, which disproportionately do impact women, Indigenous women, those with mental health issues, and we don't want to see anything that would contribute to that. And if I could also pick up on your last two questions to our sisters at Native Women's Association, I think one of the things that could be added into the bill, and the preamble in particular, would be picking up on the recommendation of both Teresa Edwards and Michelle Audette, is a specific reference to the importance of recognizing and promoting the provisions of the UN Declaration on Indigenous Peoples, as well as the Section 15 equality issues, and the need to link this issue of the increased risk of women being in prostitution to economic and social and cultural and political security, and so, or equality, sorry, and security of the person. So I think those would be ways to strengthen it. And unless I wasn't clear at all before, we don't have faith that the provisions, even with those alone, will solve this issue. The notion of decriminalizing women is fundamental, but without all of those other facets, we are not likely to see significant positive change for women in this country.
Those questions and answers. Our next question from the Conservative Party is Ms. Ambler.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to all of our witnesses for being here today. We really appreciate your input. And for the record, Madame Audette, my mother wasn't thrilled when I told her I wanted to be a member of Parliament. I'd like to ask you, just following up on some testimony that we heard yesterday. There was a woman who was here who questioned the committee's commitment to getting that the Aboriginal viewpoint on the record, and in particular Aboriginal prostitutes and Aboriginal women involved in prostitution, and so I wanted to, frankly, I wanted to give our our clerk and this committee, of which I'm not a regular member, some credit, and I wanted to make sure that I have it right, and that because I believe that inviting the National or the Native Women's Association of Canada, that we've got really the ultimate and best representatives of women who are prostitutes and who are Aboriginal as well. Would you say that you are here representing and being their voice?
I'll try in English, okay? I always said since day one that I was elected, I am not the national voice, but I'm the tool. I'm the person who walks beside and with the women. I don't know everybody. Not everybody knows me. So it's tough to say that I represent or NWAC as president, but that's my values. But I have big ears, big heart. And yes, I listen a lot, and we make sure that we have a strong network across Canada. Like I mentioned at the beginning with the Provincial and Territorial Members Association, we make sure that we connect with them.
You talk about hopes and dreams, and these are the kinds of things that, if not formally represent all Aboriginal women, including those involved in prostitution, but certainly reflect a lot of the aspirations of the women. Ms. Edwards?
Also, just to add to that, NWAC has recently completed a research report on Aboriginal women and sex trafficking, and we're waiting for the Canadian Women's Foundation to release their report so that we can release ours, because it was a sub-report. And we are very proud. We worked for over a year and a half, and NWAC has worked for at least a decade with our members, our constituents across Canada, throughout communities, where we have dealt with women who are Aboriginal women who are in prostitution, who have been in prostitution, who were sex trafficked as a child, and then deemed to be prostituted because they came of age after being sex exploited and trafficked for 8 years. So this is not our views. These are the views that we're bringing forward of the women and the many women that have given us the mandate at our annual General Assembly, yearly resolutions on this issue, to come forward with our position as part of the coalition and to the Supreme Court of Canada in the Bedford case. So this is not advocating for the view of 2 or 3% of Aboriginal women. I, in fact, would argue, when you hear other women state that we should not argue for the 2 or 3% who state that this is their right to do this, and sacrifice the 97 who will be unprotected and live in violent conditions. So I just wanted to back that up to say one of our key informants had dealt with 4,000 victims of violence in her 20 years of experience. So we had very valuable key informants that we dealt with, and our Aboriginal women are our best informants on the ground, and they're the ones that have told us what the reality is for them on this issue.
Thank you. Ms. Walker, I'd like to thank you for addressing the point that prostitution has always been around, because we hear that so often, right? You're not really going to change anything. And so I like to hear that that the goal is really, while the goal might be to eradicate it, that even a substantial reduction is a qualified success. And I wanted to talk to you specifically about those exit supports that the London Abused Women's Centre is working on, and you mentioned that they're directed by the women themselves, so I want to know what that means. And so my question is, what types of programs do you implement, and which are most successful, and what are the challenges that you face reaching out to women?
And so, I do not know. It's amazing. What am I doing? It's not me. Oh, so they're the electric one.
I didn't do nothing. No, it's the volume. It's the volume. It's the volume.
It's all the energy, that's right. There we go. All right. Thank you so much for that question. So the London Abused Women's Centre's philosophy is that we would never tell a woman what to do. We would always offer her choices. and explain the options available to her, and then support her in whatever option she decided. We also are a voluntary agency. We don't support mandated services for women because we know that women need to be able to come in on their own accord when they are ready. And just as leaving an abusive intimate partner is a process, so too is leaving prostitution. And women may make attempts to leave and then re-enter and make attempts to leave. So it is a process, and women need to do that on their own terms. So what women have identified to us is that they need a range of services. They need long-term, woman-centered, trauma-informed services, and generally request that those services be provided by educated survivors. So they would like to be able to speak to somebody that is informed. They oftentimes come to us and require either residential rehab services or substance abuse services to overcome some of those challenges. They identify to us that another option for them may be family reintegration, that for so long they've had no access, been isolated from their families, and that's important. Many of the women that come to us have had no access to secondary or post-secondary education and would like to really explore their dreams, fulfill those dreams, whether it be in teaching or nursing or city planning, whatever it might be. So they need access to those resources. So it is a range of services that are provided. So we sit with women, we do an extensive intake with them, we determine where they're at, what is the priority for them at that time, and that priority can change. So when we meet with them the next week, they may say, now I'm going in this direction. And also because of that link between domestic violence and prostitution, we're also trying to address those issues. And so many women have lost their children, and they're also suffering the enormous grief of that. So it is a range of services. We have great success. We have great success in, mostly helping women by referral services to addiction services, helping women reintegrate with their families. We live in a very generous community that has supported women, and once they have their adult education for secondary school, allowing them the opportunities with grants and going and furthering their education at college or university. We have great success stories, and it has to be voluntary, and it has to be led by the women themselves. And I did discuss very briefly the $20 million. Can I just discuss that really briefly again? Because one of the things, and again, we are a very...
It doesn't preclude there being other announcements.
No, I understand that. And we also do depend on our partners in the community. Our budget at the London Abused Women's Centre is around $850,000 per year. As I stated earlier, we serve about 3,300 women. We have a staff of 11. So we're very busy, as you can imagine, serving that number of people. And of course, our salaries are, nobody complains because nobody does our work because it's a job at our place. It's really a passion. But there's rent and overhead, and we pay the transportation costs of the women that come to see us. We make sure they have food when they come to see us. But it is expensive to provide these services. And what we want to make sure is that women in prostitution have access to long-term service. They suffer incredible trauma. It's not a situation where they can come in for only 6 weeks. This is long-term service that we are ensuring they are engaged in.
And we take this seriously as well. This government, as you may know, in the 2014 budget, committed $25 million to violence against women initiatives. And so, we're quite proud of that. And I know a lot of talk has been about the $20 million, and I appreciate that you mentioned it. It's really the initial,
Thank you, Ms. Ambler. That's your time.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for your questions and answers.
No, that was perfect.
So our next questioner is Madame Paquet from the New Democratic Party.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur. Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and thank you to the witnesses. This is very interesting, all of your presentations. I just want to mention something. It's $20 million over 5 years, which is $4 million per year. And the Minister from Manitoba indicated that would mean about $200,000 or less per year for Manitoba. when we talk about a drop in a bucket of water, less than $200,000 for a province that spends $8 million just to deal with the issue of prostitution, it's like a slap in the face. My question is for Ms. Pate and Ms. Edwards. There are certain sections in the criminal code that criminalize human trafficking. 279.01, exploitation 279.04, paragraphs 1 and 2, and section 213, which was invalidated by the Supreme Court, but which criminalized, according to the criminal code, to retain sexual services of a person. How does Bill C-36 improve the situation? There is already legislation in place. The situation is very troubling. Since yesterday, everyone has told us just how the situation of women on the ground is extremely troubling. What does C-36 offer in terms of helping women to get out? Is it just 20 million? What changes the situation that we are in now?
Would like to go.
Or
Who would you
Mrs.
like to go
Odette,
first? Who'd you like to go?
I don't decide. Whoever wants to go first, I decide. Okay, Mrs. Pate and then Mrs. Edwards.
Thank you.
Okay. Well, I think the key, as I hope we've been clear, the key point is that the message is being sent very clearly that it is not okay to buy and sell women, one. But what will help will be the broader initiatives as well that we've talked about, the need for the funding, the need for other supports, the need for an equality, a substantive equality focus. But the other piece that I think is vital that we haven't talked a lot about, but that we have talked to the women about, is that if they know, one of the women said to me just recently that if she knew that that she could not be criminalized at all for what she was engaged in, but that the man who she was providing a sex service to could be, she would feel much safer. Even if she never decided to call the police, she would know that, and he would know that that was clearly the message. That was something I hadn't particularly thought of at that stage, but I since then have spoken to other women, and I know that some of my colleagues have as well. And so I think that message is very clear. And again, even though we know, as Deb Kilroy just pointed out earlier, even though we know that laws prohibiting violence against women have not stopped violence against women, it has sent a very clear message it's not acceptable. That is an important step in the milestone around violence against women on this issue. I would suggest that to say that it is not okay to buy and sell women is vitally important.
I agree. As was mentioned and has been mentioned before, we haven't seen the uptake on the criminalization of the men previously, and we're hoping that this will send a key message to Canadians that this is no longer tolerable, that we want more, and that women are not disposable, and women are worth more, and they can, if they so choose, exercise their right to criminalize the men exercising violence against them. I do see a significant difference from what existed before and with what exists now.
But, okay, sorry, yeah. But the woman, as we were discussing previously, according to the new legislation, the women are still criminalized in virtue of, publicity in public places where children might, or this is pretty much almost everywhere. I mean, I'm walking in the streets, there could be children walking, or wherever I am, there could be children. I mean, coming out the parliament, there might be children. I'm just saying it's not. So women are still criminalized under the new bill. So that's what I'm saying, is that what will it change from the previous situation? Because there might not be criminalized under all circumstances, but they are still according to the new legislation. So that's my point is, what will it change because they are still criminalized?
Yeah, thank you for clarifying. I was making my comments in addition to what I already said. We do not support anything in the bill that would criminalize women. None of the provisions that would cause the women to be potentially criminalized.
I see Mrs. Walker wanted to.
Further to that comment, and as you know, I think almost unanimously, most of your delegates that have appeared before you are recommending that women not be criminalized. But in addition, there are going to be no big miraculous differences tomorrow morning or once the bill is passed. This is about long-term changes, shifting a culture, and it's about shifting the culture for future generations. And if you look at what's happened in Sweden, for instance, there has been a decrease in the number of men who are first-time buyers, for instance. The support in Sweden for the bill, for the Nordic model, is about 70%. So there's a shift in the attitude, and it's more than just the exit programs, it's about public awareness campaigns. And so the goal is to ensure that girls who are growing up know there are more options available to them than just prostitution. And it's about educating the future for boys to know that women are not to be bought and sold, that women have equal rights, and that women are actually human beings.
So, because I've heard my colleagues across the way saying that money will be given to organization to fund exit programs. So do you agree with me that the needs are much larger than just exit programs? Just yes or no? Because I see all the witnesses.
And in fact, we believe the $20 million is to accommodate the exit programs, the police training, and the public awareness campaigns.
Okay. Thank you very much. Thank you for those questions and answers. Our next question from the Conservative Party is Mr. Decker.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thanks to each of our witnesses. Ms. MacLeod, I just want to say to you that I really appreciate you being here and having the courage to tell us your story. And it's not just that you're helping us as legislators with this bill, but I think you're helping all Canadians understand the situation. And far beyond the people in this room, people are watching across Canada, and they're hearing your words, and that's true of all the women who have testified before us. So I just want you to know that, and I want, through you, to thank all of the women who have appeared before us to tell us these stories about prostitution in Canada. And Ms. Walker, I just want to also thank you for helping and facilitating women that your organization helps to participate in the consultation that the government did. I know that you did that. You mentioned it in your opening remarks. I think it's really important. I wanted to mention earlier today we heard from Emily Simons of Power here in Ottawa, and she said that her organization did the same thing with respect to many of the sex workers that they work with here in Ottawa, and gave them the opportunity to participate in that online consultation so that the government could hear their views, and that's very important to us, so I wanted to thank them as well. Now, each of you have spoken a little bit about this whole issue of a choice, whether the majority of people in the business of prostitution are actually making a free choice. You talked about it, Ms. MacLeod. I know, Ms. Odette, you spoke about it, and Ms. Edwards, I think you did. I think one or both of our witnesses who are in New York mentioned it. If you have no other option to support yourself and your family, to put food on the table, to pay the rent, if you have an addiction, whether it's drug or alcohol or something else, are you really making a free choice? I'd like to hear each of your views on that.
Start with you, Ms. MacLeod.
Thank you. That is the point that I've been trying to get across. You know, people talk about human trafficking and prostitution as two different things. In my mind, they're one and the same, whether you're being physically forced to do something or you're being forced because of social or economical situations. For me, myself, when I did get recruited at 21 years old, I was at a desperate point. I had had kids. I was on welfare. I was coming in and out of abusive situations. I didn't know how to maintain anything, nor did I have an education from having kids so young. So in my mind, it was like, wow, I'm going to be able to finally do something to make money to help my kids. And I don't need to get, have a college degree or have them checking me, or I'm not going to work in a, warehouse for 12 hours a day and then I can't afford babysitting. So this is the problem that I'm seeing with a lot of women. And the problem is trying to get the women out. What are we going to put them on? Welfare? Welfare doesn't even pay their rent. And I'm having this problem right now with the women that I'm dealing with.
The majority of women who are in this trade, it's not a free choice between two consenting adults. A lot of the people who support the industry say, why should the government be interested or involved at all? It's really just a free exchange between two reasonable, rational, equal consenting adults.
We all hate our jobs, some of us, I don't know, but some of us in life hate our jobs. But being a prostitute is a job that you're going to every day to be raped and to be violated and to be used and abused for a man's own, pleasure. And I don't see how that is a choice.
Okay. I'd like to hear the views of the Native Women's Association on that as well.
If we were to look at this as a legitimate job and we were to give have job fairs at universities, I highly doubt this would be a successful job fair booth that we would want to see as options for our children and future generations to be going to. And I would not want to see it legitimized in any way, so that we would be telling our children if they had one job at McDonald's and then they couldn't work anywhere else, that a brothel were available. Rather than go on EI, they're compelled to go work at that brothel. I don't think any MP here would want that option for their children either. So that comes along with the concept that this is a legitimate choice, a decent workplace, equal power. Okay, we're not talking moral, we're talking about power and difference here. We already know there's a high rate of missing and murdered Native women, but for the fact that they're targeted for their race and their gender because they're seen by society as being devalued and disposable. If society isn't caring about missing and murdered, how are they going to possibly care about Native women who are in prostitution? And how do these women have real choices?
Fair enough. Okay, thank you. Ms. Pate, do you have a view on that question?
Yeah, I think while I think the notion of choice is often fallacious, I'm prepared to accept there are women who argue that they are making choices. I don't think a position of decriminalizing the women interferes with those women at all, and certainly the evidence in other jurisdictions has supported that, and I think you've heard ample evidence of that. But again, without the additional supports, I think, another thing you may want to put in the preamble, I would strongly urge, is something around the need for national standards. I mean, as has just been pointed out, the option of going on social assistance, I mean, that is not an option for most individuals to support themselves, because with the elimination of the national standards around those areas, we've seen basically an infinitely criminalizable group, predominantly women, created because you can't support yourself. So again, it goes back to the need not just for $20 million, whether you call it a drop in the bucket, a slap in the face. The reality is we need some clear measures to say we're fundamentally committed to women's equality, and that the bill alone will not do that.
Thank you.
Even with the amendments.
There's another question I think is important I want to ask, and that is, many critics say that criminalizing the purchase of sex will drive the sex trade further underground and make the sex trade more dangerous than it currently is in Canada. Now, all of you accept that the criminalization of the purchase of sex is a positive step forward. What do you say to those critics? I start maybe with you, Ms. Pate.
Yeah, I can't see how it could be any more dangerous than it already is for most of the women. Certainly the women that I've lived, worked, and walked with for the last 30 years. It couldn't be more dangerous than it already is. As I mentioned, many of the women we work with, particularly those who've already been criminalized, are being bought and sold not just for sex, but also by men who want to degrade, abuse, everything from punching to electrocuting to all kinds, and murder. So it is a dangerous area for women now, and I don't know how it could be made more dangerous. And certainly I think I can understand why that is a position being taken, but much as we've seen, people lobby for other harms, other approaches that are harmful, the reality is, in jurisdictions where they have actually developed resources and social supports and economic supports, combined with a change to the law, we see a very different result than, in fact, in places where when I was in Amsterdam last year, as well as in Thailand, where we have seen decriminalization, demand goes up, and in fact, we see all women who go into areas being at more risk, including those of us who may not be engaged in prostitution at the time. So, I think that's fallacious.
That would like to answer.
Thank you very much.
Next.
I have a question to all of us right now, and for those who's listening. How many of the pimps, the johns, the buyers, the sex industry is criminalized right now? How many of them? We know that 90% of them are men. How many of those men are criminalized? But when we reverse the question for the women and Aboriginal women, we know, I think Kim Pate can confirm that, we are the one who are criminalized right now. So with this legislation, we will reverse that, hopefully. The buyers, the pimp, so I can finish?
Okay, sure.
So we have to remember, for those who says that back in the alley, women will be more in danger, that's where programs, services that are so important, and the police force, they have to change also their culture, the way they're dealing with women in prostitution.
Okay, thank you very much. That's it. I'm sorry, we're way over time. So thank you for those questions and answers. Our next questioner is Mr. Jacob.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Merci à nos témoins d'être.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to the witnesses for being here with us this afternoon. My first question is for you, Ms. Pate, and to all of the other panelists who can answer it, including Ms. Kilroy. According to you, if the Conservative government were to behave more proactively to ensure equality between the sexes, would that make a difference in the fight against exploitation and violence against women?
I hope I've been clear that I would think so. I don't think that's part of the bill at this stage. And I just want to pick up on the last point, the question that was raised earlier, and the point that Michelle Odette raised, which is when we fought to have, initially to have women decriminalized, and I'm talking now back before the last set of amendments to the prostitution laws, we argued that in fact women should be decriminalized, and instead of the asymmetrical application of the law against women that was happening then, we were offered by the government of the day the de-gendering of the law, and soliciting for the purpose of prostitution was brought in. When that happened, we immediately saw exactly what Michelle Odette has spoken about, which is the continued criminalization of women and the development of diversion programs for men. And I would suggest to you that I don't know how many men who have pimped and who have been procurers or exploiters of women are coming before the committee. I dare say probably not many, if any. But I've certainly been raising this question across the country. When I worked with men, when I worked with young people, and since I've worked with women, I've yet to see a man jailed only for pimping or for buying sex. Not a man in this country has been jailed for that. If they've been jailed, it's because they have also harmed, assaulted, killed, done something else. And that is, I'm not suggesting we want to see more people jailed, but this notion that, in fact, we're going to see increased numbers of people at risk when we've got a whole culture that has supported men buying and selling women for a long time is fallacious. It's nonsense. We're not likely to see that. That doesn't mean I think that women should be criminalized. Absolutely. If there's any doubt, take all of those provisions out, put equality provisions in, make sure there are supports in place, re-inject national standards, have supports for guaranteed livable income. I'm repeating myself now, so I'll shut up. But that's, really, we need to see a fundamental approach that puts front and center women's substantive equality.
A really important question, and what I would like to see is governments at all levels invest more in equality rights for women, and I would also like to see all parties invest in equality rights for women. And in fact, that's the very reason we are all here advocating for the passage of Bill C-36, with the exception of those amendments we've proposed, because we believe it will promote equality rights for women.
Merci, Madame Walker. Y a-t-il d'autres personnes qui veulent réagir?
Thank you. Would you like to answer to the question as well? Very well. Ms. Kilroy, did you want to respond?
I agree with Ms. Pate. We need to come from a position of substantive equality. So I'd be more than happy for the bill to bring any laws that are about equality for women and that it is gendered as such. Because when we have degendered legislation, we see that it's the women cop the brunt of the negatives of such legislation. I suppose I can think about a piece of legislation in Australia, in our jurisdiction, around domestic violence laws, how we as women advocated for protection of women against domestic violence. However, the legislation was degendered, and how we see that play out on the ground is that the women are now being criminalised. So the police come into the homes, they will give a domestic violence order, issue a domestic violence order to the man and the woman, and then if there's another incident, and this predominantly happens in Aboriginal communities, the police come back and it is the woman that is arrested for breaching the domestic violence order and a reactive violent offence because she's protected herself from the violence that the partner has perpetrated against her. So we see more Aboriginal women, for example, criminalised because of those domestic violence laws that are degendered.
Merci, Madame Kilroy.
Thank you, Ms. Kilroy. My second question is has the government held sufficient consultation? This is for Ms. Odette and all of the other panelists as well. Has the government held sufficient consultation, in your opinion, before proposing this bill? Are 4 days of hearings enough to study this bill adequately, according to you? I'll start. Any bill, any law which needs to be amended, I would say, over the last 20 years, regardless of which government is in power, there has never been enough time, especially when it comes to Aboriginal women's point of view. I would say that it's the same situation now. However, since 1974, we've been developing our expertise, that we've been working with women, that we've been working for women. I would say that the 2 or 3 hours that we're spending with you is far from enough. But I believe that you have enough matter before you to make the changes that we are asking of you. An exercise which will have to be done eventually. When we talk about consultation, we're also talking about fully enlightened consent, understanding what's happening. If we talk about the issue of Aboriginal women in matters such as this, we have to provide the tools necessary to our organizations in order to hold those kinds of round tables. That way, the people who are directly affected and organizations who defend their interests can bring recommendations forward to you.
There could never be too much of a good thing of consultations, and clearly I'm of the opinion that the chairman today only gave me 5 minutes. and not the full 10. Or I had that speech time to the minute.
You
but
have 12 minutes if you really want to know.
Oh, I'm just teasing. Anyway, but many of us did have the opportunity to meet with individual MPs in advance of today. Many of you who are around this table today. And we've also had numerous phone calls and things like that. But of course, we would like many more hours of consultation to convince you of our views.
Okay. And our last questioner wanted to follow up on his previous question, I think. Mr. Decker.
From Ms. Walker and Ms. McLeod on that point, do you think criminalizing the purchase of sex will make the sex trade more dangerous in Canada?
And I'm so glad to come back to you on that, because I had one squeezy little answer on your choice thing too, because no, prostitution is inherently violent. We hear that consistently from every woman we've worked with, and it will not make it more violent to criminalize to criminalize Johns and pimps. And again, we need to look to future generations about how we're going to change things. As for demand, your question about choice previously, it's really important that when people ask that question, we give it back to them and talk about how when you ask about the choice of women, when you ask about the decisions of women, it re-victimizes them again because it blames them. And we need to stop asking about the choices of women and instead ask Johns and pimps, why do you choose to do this to women?
From anybody. Thank you. Ms. McLeod?
I mean, you have to understand, for me, I mean, the Johns and the pimps and the traffickers aren't being criminalized right now, and I was being beaten all of the time. So to criminalize them, it's going to move it underground and it's going to cause it to be more dangerous. It's not. Prostitution is violence against women, any way you want to cut it. These are not normal men who are coming in to use these women. They are coming in to use these women because there's things that they would not do that they think is not proper to their wives, so they're going to use women like me. Things that they want to live out fantasies, they're going to do to women that they can degrade. And this is what I've seen time and time again. I could tell you countless hours of stories about the things that I have been made to do that were very degrading of what men wanted. So I think criminalizing them and making them held accountable, they need to be punished for their actions, because you can't go around hurting people. We wouldn't allow this to happen to our children. So why are we allowing it to happen to our women?
Very much. Thank you for those questions and answers. Thank you for being witnesses to this study on C36. We will be continuing to looking at it further today and again tomorrow and on Thursday, and we appreciate your input on this bill. With that, we will adjourn for approximately a half an hour.